welcome to Voicecraft. This is a very special episode, one I'm delighted to welcome with Carl Hayden Smith and Cameron Duffy. Carl is an associate professor of media in the School of Arts and Creative Industries at University of East London. He's also the founder of the Museum of Consciousness, working with musicians and artists to create immersive experiences designed to alter and expand states of consciousness. He's developing hyperhumanism, which reframes technology as a catalyst for developing our own innate human abilities. And Cameron Duffy is a philosopher and counselor and has spent his adult lifetime exploring the nature of being, healing, and human possibility through the transformation of consciousness. He discovered the non-dual potential of conscious experience during his early adult development and has been focused on the scientific, alchemical, and embodied philosophies that bind the nature of consciousness with the meaning-making journey. And today we're inviting a conversation that explores the meaning of hyperhumanism. We'll see where it goes. One of the guiding questions for me there is, are we human yet? Are we human yet? And what would that mean to become more fully human? And with that, I'll pass it over to Cam and welcome you both.
So this question, are we human yet? What I'm curious about is what that actually sparks in you, that question of, are we human yet? Obviously, this is something that has been contemplated for a long time. Various frames have been applied to this. And of course, context design is part of your repertoire. But what comes to mind for you is most meaningful when you contemplate, are we human yet?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, it's a provocation really, because I think that we may have been human at some point and then lost our humanity. I think we've taken the humanity out of the human and are continuing that extraction process. So it seems like, we've zombified ourselves just with like really basic, well, not basic, but, technologies like your mobile phone. Seems to have led to a situation where you could be, the love of your life could walk past, but you wouldn't notice because you're just on that tiny bit of real estate. So I think poorly designed technology has led to us being less human. Technocentric design rather than human-centric design. I think that, there are now moves. We're seeing even centers spring up, dedicated to human flourishing. And I don't think we'd necessarily see such centers arise if we didn't have a problem with human flourishing. I think a lot of people are sort of living but not thriving, not really getting to experience their full dynamic range of what it means to be human. And all the time we're coming up with these theories, these transhuman theories or post-human theories, which imply that we're not grateful for our human journey, and we want to outdo it. We want to overcome it. It's the Gnostic position of, the messy meat spaces to be overcome, whether that's through the death process or through, religion or through just generally, a lack of vitamin G. So how do we build more humility into the process? Understand that we are, very blessed to have these bodies that are far more intelligent than we are. And I think it is about getting into the body in a fresh way that we haven't maybe done for a while because of the distraction, the continual distraction of all the technologies around us. And, I think even if you look at the quantified self movement, you could argue that kind of takes us away. It abstracts things. It almost, one of my friends, Darren Stevenson, he's always comparing us to insects or to other species. And, there's a big narrative around us being technology or us being simulation, a part of a simulation. So it's very much around the narratives. I think that we are having to sort of bear all these very transhuman thought patterns, and it's like the hikikomori of the human. How do we avoid all these escape routes, whether it's through psychedelics, whether it's through VR, whether it's through dream recording. There's plenty of now escape routes available to us that can mean we do circumvent the human experience. Like DMTx, for instance, continuous infusion of DMT would mean that you would potentially live in hyperspace. And I think that misses the point. I think that we have 1,000 months to live a human existence. If we're lucky, that's 83 years. And people don't realize this. I mean, when I said it to people, there's a bit of a light bulb moment where it's like, holy monkeys. It's like, it's short and brutal. I've got a large record collection next to me over here. And when I'm playing these records, that a lot of them are older than me, and a lot of them will outlive me. And I'm always conscious that I'm the ephemeral one in the room, not the vinyl. So what does that mean? So it's all of these sorts of things. I hope that's a bit of a buffet of different ways of looking at the question.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. One of the initial things I heard was, I'm familiar with Graham Hancock expressing the idea that we're a species in amnesia. Heard a little bit of that coming through in the beginning. And Tim's also he's also mentioned the phrase discoveries are recoveries. And, there's just so much loaded into all of this when it comes to the work of many people, and the technological context is at a critical point, it seems, all things considered at the moment, with a lot going on there. And I'm also reminded of Ian McGilchrist's work when it comes to looking at the different cultural sensibilities that are associated with hemispheric asymmetries, and how that looks at the way values are capitulated in culture. And the way we might actually be going in a certain direction that is out of balance with realizing what it actually means to be human, in the sense that you might be opening up to there. Part of all of this gives me a sense as someone who's looked at the way in which our attention is or can be captured, and the adaptive aspect of this, how we look at conceiving of ourselves in terms of the external focus, and the way we might get lost in certain maps accordingly, and the way in which our pursuit of certainty might entrap us in ways that are not always obvious until they start to escalate or become nested, or whatever we might want to refer to here. And so, what does it mean to actually pay attention to something that isn't simply out there or contained within an internal consistency model of the way things are supposed to be, and the way transcendence might be captured by a causal model in our mind versus what is actually more in the domain of the uncertain, that actually contains a bit more opening to our potential. Another thing that I'm curious about exploring, based on your prompt there, in a sense, is what are we not bringing into consciousness when we go down a certain path of presuming human nature is contained within a certain paradigm that is very limited and leads in a certain technological direction, which captures our culture and individuals in various ways. What is the role of the psychoid, or aspects of non-egoic information systems, and what is the understanding here of the mystery of being? You mentioned that these bodies are, in a sense, more intelligent than us. To me, that's kind of an opening into just trying to discover what on earth self-organizing systems uh, can be understood as. And this is, again, the part of discovering what does it mean to be human, and how do we actually how do we realize what direction to go in when we've got an initial prototype of what that could mean? There are many other directions that are coming to mind at the moment, but I'm curious as to any of that is sort of opened a context in yourself that you're wanting to explore at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's really about looking into our deepest history and understanding it's really the indigenous that will survive what's coming. I think if we don't have those skill sets, Zizek talks about the digital distance. That is the illusion that just because we have everyone at our fingertips, we feel safe. We feel as if everything's in order because of that digital distance that is the social web that we live within. But I'm conscious that if I don't have the hyperhuman skills of foraging, of understanding the land, understanding not just where how I am, but where I'm going and where I'm coming from. So I love that in that indigenous sense, that they don't ask you how you are, they ask you where are you coming from and where are you going. So it's much more about spatial awareness. And I've just come back from Cairo, where they have the Biogeometry Institute, and it's they're starting to understand the relationship between sound and shape. What's the power of aesthetics? What's the power of these sort of spatial awarenesses? And I think that we're critically underdeveloped when it comes to spatial awareness, even like the way we use GPS to understand how we move around our own towns. We haven't even got familiar with those because we've circumvented that necessity with a technology that just is convenient, but it atrophies our ability to learn about where we are in space. So I think it's really about understanding what happens if the lights go out. Where are we if the lights go out? And they are going out. We've seen that in Spain and Portugal and Central Europe. This last couple of weeks, there was a whole day without electricity. And of course, everyone's like, well, how are they doing? How are they surviving without electricity? And of course, they're thriving, going back to that point around, because they suddenly are present to each other. They're suddenly aware. And my friends have just started a community called Ansol in London, which is context engineering at its heart. It's this idea of bringing people together. I mean, rents in London are absurd. So what they have, they've bought up a massive like X hotel, and they've got 300 rooms, and they're basically putting in those rooms conscious individuals that want to build community, that want to thrive together. So they have all of these events, and they it's a bit like a burn, like a festival, but more of a burn where people are giving and gifting what they're good at to that community, and they're creating resilience around that context engineering. So I think it's really about, do you want to be in a box, cut off with your partner, without community, without the web, without the safety net? I mean, I'll give you a good example. We had a power cut here in London, which was kind of local. It was our street, but the whole place went down. And my girlfriend was like, she loved it because suddenly she's like, let's get the candles out. Let's start reading. Let's go back to basics. And what was interesting is that we've got a WhatsApp group for the whole building. So the block has around 200 flats in it, and everyone's suddenly becoming a mycelium network because we're asking the question, how much power have you got? Have you got a power bank? Do you need power? And this community sensation of, we're looking after each other, because some people had like 8 power banks, some people had none. So it's about distributing that wealth, distributing that knowledge, and suddenly you realize the real wisdom, the real intelligence is underneath our feet. And all we need to do is really adopt that kind of operating system where you share. When you're in abundance, you automatically share. You don't even think about it. It's not like it's not even a decision to make. It's something that's automated. It's your default mode network. You share not just with your own species, but with everything else. So the mycelium are sharing with the plants, with the trees, and keeping everything going. So the wood wide web, in that sense, is for me that direction. Even though it's, in some people say, "Oh, that's regressive." I'm like, is it? Isn't it much more regressive to hoard and be a billionaire where you can't even utilize that kind of wealth because you're only here for 1,000 months? and you can only have one lunch a day. So it's like, that's for me is the anti-intelligence. It's the corrosive impulse that we have with this extractive capitalism. So how do we, even if we could have a real-time representation, maybe through, I know my friends Marshmallow Laser Feast have already done this, where you can actually see through mixed reality that intelligence everywhere underneath your feet, and that's like the ultimate psychedelic for me. That's like really a massive game changer, to realize there are other species on this planet which are larger than us, more intelligent than us, and there's this overemphasis of intelligence when it should be about wisdom. All the AI modeling is not looking at wisdom, it's not looking at compassion. And my friend David Hansen clocked onto this very early on when he makes robots, and he was like, the only way we're only going to bake in this wisdom is through biologically making bodies for these robots and having them have childhoods and therefore have trauma and therefore have compassion. And that's kind of a very transhuman vision as well, but it's also, there's some hyperhumanism mixed in there, so hyperhuman thinking at least. So I think that, we've got these decisions to make, and you probably heard of organoids, now this ability to make computation with AI using human neurons, human cells. And again, this is, for me, hugely problematic because we don't know where consciousness resides. I believe I'm a much more of an idealist perspective. I think that everything's conscious, and we come out of consciousness rather than consciousness coming out of our brains. I believe that everything's conscious, including the table that I'm sitting in front of. So it's really about having that respect for life and being humble and grateful and open, and not locking yourself in to these thought patterns. And I have to even always like question hyperhumanism, and I'm like, is hyperhumanism appropriate? Is it the correct way to go? I think it's more hyperhumanism. How do we be more humane, not just to ourselves, but to every species on the planet, of which we're made of? We think we're these discrete humans, which is the problem with humanism. They put us as these apex creatures. And what we actually are is that we're 50% bacteria and we're covered in fungi. So we're much more like a nested ecology. We're much more like a three kingdom or queendom operation. And I think we're not human yet because we don't know that. We don't often think that. We think we're these individuals, and we're in the cult of the individual, the time of the cult of the individual, where it's all about maximizing your life at the cost of everything else, generally. So I think that if we could have a decent definition of what we are, then we can work off that basis.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Part of what I heard is a little bit of nostalgia in relation to Terence McKenna's idea of the archaic revival. It's not necessarily a denial of technology, but a recapturing of what it means to be connected and less reliant on technology, and upskill ourselves when it comes to the fundamentals that, as you might have described, could be in the process of being atrophied in ways that we're not necessarily cognizant of. So part of that word, as you've referred to it, hyperhumanism, involves a recovery of connection. This seems to be fundamental. You've referred to perhaps transhumanism and this hyper-individualism associated with accumulation, which is on the one hand a very understandable approach to a fundamental insecurity. But on the other hand, it's also a process and a game that if your feedback systems are being dictated by that as a teleological imperative, then you might find that meaning is actually fading the more you become that which you're molding in that process. Or maybe you're being lost in the process of trying to find yourself in what is fundamentally an imbalance there. And Perhaps this also relates to the concept of death, or a kind of closing off from what it means to uh, face that transience associated with being embodied. And so when you mention the idea of connection, and a lot of those ideas are about realizing interconnection, how do you think people can experience something that draws them back into that potential to value other than that which is driving them towards this orientation that is excessively patterned through technology?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on the real juice there. I think that it is about learning to die before you die. I think it's about getting familiar with these liminal spaces that we enter every night when we go to sleep. I think it's about being much more sensitive to what those mini deaths are. You know, when we disappear from consciousness or our own self consciousness, we enter realms that arguably are more more real in some sense, more hyper real. And same with the psychedelic experience, that we open up access to parallel worlds, seemingly with their own ontologies, with their own entities. And a lot of people deny that they don't want to be aware of those. It's ontologically too shocking. But I think if we are to circumvent, as you said, a lot of people can't face the transience of the embodiment that they're within, and it's a coping strategy. I think transhumanism it's just the denial of not just death but of life, because they are so related. And of course we could have we do have longer lives just because of the way we live. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that the big problem is we don't have what's the stat? We're currently using resources for 5 planets. The average Westerner, especially the average American, is using enough resources for 5 planets, 5 planet Earths. So there's a fundamental calculation there that if you are along, somebody that's obsessed with outstaying your welcome, then you're part of the problem. And that may shift if we do have fusion, and we're allowed to have fusion, and there is suddenly free energy. um, then things shift slightly. But I still think there's a reason for death, and I think that death is not what it appears. I think that my take on death is that it is an expansion of consciousness and not ending of consciousness. So I don't fear death. I still want to have a full maximized life, which is why I'm really trying to maximize each day. As Nietzsche talks about the eternal recurrence, or amor fati, love your fate. I'm certainly a practitioner of that, because I'm aging, and I'm not trying to deny that aging. I'm not like dyeing my gray hair, because it's part of the process. And I'm practicing my vitamin G, my gratitude for this extraordinary experience. And I've been shown in my sort of non-drug interpersonal transpersonal experiences that I'm more than this life. It may be that I have this life over and over again, as Nietzsche theorizes, which is an interesting operating system to adopt, because if you do live the same life eternally, then really make sure that you're not doing even a single day that you don't want to do, because you know you're going to have each day infinitely. So, and of course that sounds like what there's lots of problems there as well, in terms of if you're born into a war zone and you can't escape, then of course you wouldn't necessarily want to have that life even once, let alone infinitely. But I think that we do have more than one life. I mean, I've had an out of body experience where I was shown I was living 9 lives in parallel. Like my soul group was nine bodies, 9 independent parallel lives, and I'm only aware of this one. and may be able to plug into those other lives through different techniques, hyperhuman techniques, whether it's hypnosis or whether it's breath work or, the endo technologies. That's where the fruits of hyperhumanism really lie, whether it's your darkness retreats, your fasting, your all of these things that you can do without external technology, I would say are more hyperhuman. But I'm not trying to discount technology as a whole through this practice. I'm saying we can use even the technologies that we have, like your mobile phone, by having, a stand where you can put your phone and then have a mouse where you can plug your phone in, and I'm not actually touching this device anymore. I'm not zombified by it because I use it as a much more in an ergonomic way, and I'm creating a barrier to entry. So I touch my phone like 5 times a day instead of 150 times, and I think that there are ways that you can use your technology. There's this, I think it's called Forest, where you can grow a tree on your screensaver all the time you're not touching your phone. It's growing this digital tree, and if it fully grows over a few hours of you not touching your phone, then a real tree is planted. So it's all about how do we use the technology in a more not just human-centric way, but in a multi-species centric way that enables us to become more grateful for and more giving. It's not the extraction of like what's the best thing for me right now. It's like, let's go into human being, rather than constantly doing. Like, let's try and pause the doing and realize that you're here for a very short window of time, and how much of that time are you being in pure consciousness? So this is why Vipassana, these meditation practices, these are the things that I think we do very little of, and to bake these things into your day so you have time to reflect, because at the moment we're just chasing the next peak experience. Altered states are cheap because they're to a penny. We can, everyone's obsessed with like, what's your next altered state, but altered traits are earned, and altered traits is what we're looking for with hyperhumanism. It's a North Star. It's not something that generally is here. I would say maybe there are these sort of the master meditators that have overcome a lot of the traps of modernity, but also there's not many people that have or can afford to spend 30 years in a cave. And in fact, there's it's questionable whether that's what we should be doing at this stage, considering the state of the planet. So for me, it's really, how do we become hyperhuman and open that up to as practices that are not easily necessarily, but that are achievable, that can be done by everyone, that aren't elitist, that that inspire others, because we are mimicry machines ultimately. And if you can lead by example, and I'd love to learn about what you're doing in terms of hyperhumanism. But I think it's about crowdsourcing. It's monkey see, monkey do. It's the 100 monkey problem. If we start doing stuff, it only takes a few people to start a revolution. And I think that's why I don't give up, because I'm certainly not a hyperhuman by any means. I'm overweight. I'm unfit. I'm dependent on all sorts of things, but I'm at least in the path. I'm on the path, and I like I say, it's a North Star. It may be 500 years, and if you look at Chris Beisch, he wrote this incredible book, Diamonds from Heaven, where he did 23 years of large macrodosing LSD and had this extraordinary vision, or this experience, this continuous experience, where he was shown in 500 years there will be these superhumans, and he says you will not believe what these superhumans are capable of. But I think that we are capable of so much, and we've atrophied a lot of it, and we don't know the complexities of what's already here. So it's really about these innate abilities that we have, that we've atrophied, that we've forgotten. As you said with Tim, it's discoveries are recoveries. So we live in amnesia. We in some sense, the amnesia protects us, but also it's hindering us. And I think if we were to understand the complexity and the power of our own senses. You know, the amount of senses that you have is not 5, it's much more like 30. So how many people are aware of that, and how many people are utilizing those senses? So it's a lot to do with education. It's a lot to do with practice, and basically making sure that you do the experiential work, and you know, it's not just talking and theorizing. It's practice. It's getting out there and getting into the forest, and getting into those contexts where you can, because with context engineering, ontological design, you're very much, you know, you need to be shape shifting. You need to be in those contexts. You need to, because the context is you, that, you know, you're providing. It's this bi-directional relationship. And if we're all sitting in our little pods, with our screens, your senses are shriveling away. You know, it's a bit like when you're not in movement. There's a big relationship between movement and creativity and optic flow. You know, that we're locked in, not just to our senses. I did a TEDx talk at Oxford about this, and it was during the pandemic. So it was very much around that idea that we don't realize, but we're living in a virtual reality of our own perceptual making anyway, because we don't see ourselves as we actually look. The mirrors flip our image back to front, and we don't hear ourselves as we actually sound because of the way our voice box is, you know, relating to our hearing. So there's this cognitive dissonance when you see yourself in a true mirror, which is 2 mirrors at 90-degree angles. You're like, who's that? But it's you. You can even do it on a webcam. You can flip the image. And the same with your voice. When you hear a recording of your voice, you get this cognitive dissonance. Who's that? So other people see you as you are and hear you as you are, but you don't. So you're already kind of locked in, and we're also locked in if we're not out in the world with things moving through our peripheral vision. You're a goldfish, and you are not able to form new memories. You're not able to form creative thoughts because you're not contextually optimized for that to happen. So it's being aware of that, and being aware of what you're limiting. You may be benefiting a lot by sitting in front of a computer, but what are you losing? It's like McLuhan says, every technology is there's a benefit, but there's also you know, we're cutting something off. We are amputating as we benefit. So it's a cost benefit analysis. Always do your cost benefit analysis, you know, and everything in moderation, including moderation.
Yes, thank you. It was a very profound overview of so many important themes there. Um, I was thinking recently of the concept of metaphysical degrees of freedom. And so when I consider the trade-off scenario you just brought into consciousness, I think of that in terms of the metaphysics of how are we being constrained by the feedback systems we're relating to and patterning ourselves with. And you know, how aware are we of that in the context of the relative lapse in psychological flexibility that might actually result from that? And so it was very interesting hearing about this very practical conditioning strategy you mentioned with the phone, and I believe there was a growing of a tree that corresponds temporally to a break from using the phone, the smartphone. And so that to me is somewhat psychedelic actually, because it's a disruptive strategy, and it's being inspired by and opening up to a nature archetype of some kind, where there is a growth process and an aesthetic there that is kind of priming your unconscious for an ongoing relationship of that nature with what is meaningful about that process for you. And no doubt that will continue to recourse those if they're engaged in that to the degree to which they are. And so that's very interesting, the way we're bringing back somewhat here a relationship with the unconscious to actually consider our behavior patterns in a quantitative context, which nonetheless feeds back qualitatively, no doubt. One thing I'm curious about is what we're looking at exploring here is, you know, what does it mean to be human? You know, there's various lenses we can look through here and look at. And it seems like the hyper aspect of it is kind of forming a relationship in terms of the semantics here, that is allowing us to kind of deepen into what is possible. And one of the very interesting aspects of this is how we relate to the concept and nature of transcendence, and how we ultimately accommodate that into a state of being. You mentioned the significance of being balanced, in that we are actually in a state of being, not simply doing, as so much of culture is predicated upon to keep the wheel spinning. And so when I think of transcendence here, I think of the way in which some people who might be more geared towards the causal models associated with transhumanism uh, might envision transcendence as, again, feeling like this is the ultimate uh, historical process, that this is where they're going to end up in some mergence with technology, despite not necessarily understanding what that implies, or not being able to sort of phenomenologically consider the full implications of that. The other understanding that I think is more part of the esoteric historical lens and perennialism is what transcendence might mean in the context of Tim was speaking to Anderson Todd recently, who mentioned ontological density. So how does that actually compare to the relative prospect of technology itself, an artifact of our own creation, in a sense, containing us, versus what we can actually open up to that is less obvious if we're not engaging in disruptive strategies and opening strategies, and strategies that ultimately allow an interconnective like experience, so that we don't get lost in a sense of self that is ultimately being conditioned into a state of imbalance. One of my inspirations when it comes to the contrast here, and how we might look at understanding and or deepening our understanding of hyperhumanism, and this was inspired by the Vedic tradition, was the physicist David Bohm's notion of the implicate order, or the enfolded order. And so, from very much an Eastern perspective, this is about really opening up to what being means across transcendent thresholds of inhabitants. And you're someone who's got a lot of unique experience under experimental and other potential conditions of what it means to relate to these processes. And so I'm curious as to how you relate to the unique experiences you've had that have elements of transcendence, what this means to you in terms of hyperhumanism, and anything that might have changed in you as a result of some of these unique experiences. And we can refer to things like DMTx, we can refer to a whole host of initiatory experiences that entirely disrupt one's sense of context, and yet open simultaneously up to unimagined forms of expansion or possibilities that, in contrast, can be related to, even if it is ineffable.
Yeah, great stuff. So I think this springs to mind Vygotsky, this cognitive scientist, and he talks about the zone of proximal development, your ZPD. And I think that why I've been so drawn to these ways of stretching that zone of proximal development. So all that means is that we have a zone where we're comfortable in, and that you can be pushed further into complexity if you're relaxed, and if you're grounded in your effective state. And I think the reason why I've been so capable of going into these extreme environments, whether it's DMTx and having my brain scanned whilst being injected with DMT and very large doses, for considerable amounts of time, like 8 years at Imperial doing those experiments, is because I have this kind of this grounding in my belief that we are here to explore our consciousness, and this is really the ultimate thing that we can be doing. And I've not bought into this cultural, you've got to live a certain way, and you have to keep up with the Joneses and all of that. So I'm really very much a cybernaut as well as a psychonaut, and I really think that there's a paradox here, but we are human because of technology, and those technologies are techni. It's all about the different techni that we adopt that stretch our zone of proximal development. So how do we, like you said, we're disrupting contexts in order to further the boundary. It's a bit like, our characters are based on that being in your lowest ebb, your the most depressed state, and the highest elation, and the range there is your zone of proximal development. So how do we keep not just focusing on transcendence but incendence? And depression for me is deep rest, and it's important to have those moments of deep rest in order to really push further again after you've had that period, because I think that integration is something that's not done generally, and it certainly hasn't been done in a lot of those experiments where I'm constantly being asked to go back in. No disrespect to those contexts, but yeah, I think that we do need to have those periods of reflection baked in. It's not about jumping back in. And in fact, when you go into these, especially these psychedelic realms, often you're told, "What are you doing here again? Why are you back again?" You haven't learned, you haven't adopted, you haven't changed. You've just extracted again, and you haven't adopted. You haven't done anything with that information. You haven't applied it. And I think that's the problem at the moment. We're very much in theory. We're not in practice. We're in the doing and not in the being. So it's very much about how do we understand that these things are gifts, that these context disruptors are gifts, but they're there to be applied. So I think I love David Bohm as well, and I love the threshold crossing and what being actually means. So incendence for me is really going into the earth and going into your psyche and being, because I think whether we feel like we're going into a transcendence, we're going up or we're going down, it's the same. It's all part of this non-dual realm, and again, it's not giving priority to one or the other. And I think that everything's a teacher. And I'm good friends with my friend Adam, who runs Healing from Healing. I don't know if you've seen that Instagram channel, but check it out. Healing from Healing is for me one of the biggest messages of the moment, because we need to heal from all the healing that's going on, and there's too much emphasis on it. And again, it's a privileged position to have time to heal. But if all you're doing is trying to do all these different modalities to heal the trauma, and I think again there's this fundamental issue with everyone's focusing on their childhood trauma. Oh, I'm so trauma. It's this victim mentality, and it's stopping us from really evolving. I'd say, if you're stuck in that mindset that you're broken, then you're broken. That's the operating system that you're adopting. So I think that it's very much about get with the program, understand that you're here for a short, brutal, messy existence, and it's a learning lab. It's something that if you don't have the experience, if you're just watching the soap opera instead of doing the actual work yourself, then you're living secondhand. You're fucking an image. And you're not getting involved. And I think if you're not traveling, I love the idea that the brain is a prediction machine. So we go back to this perceptual primer, that your brain is a prediction machine. So if you're living the same life, and if that life's just going from one healing modality to the next, your brain knows that's what's coming. It can predict it, and therefore it's not waking up. It's not alive. Your brain's not alive. It's living in memory. It's the same as if you stay in the same routine in your house, if you go to work in the same way, if you you're going to get Alzheimer's because you're not breaking out of that routine and your brain is not coming online. It's only when you travel and when you go into context that you're not aware what's coming around the corner that your brain actually has to do some work. So the brain is always looking for the survival. How do I survive this? How do I survive this? So it'll go to the lowest common denominator and it will not even come to life. So I like that phrase, change is as good as a rest, because that's what happens when you travel. You come alive. And I think that, yeah, too much travel can be a problem too. So it's really about having that balance and having that understanding that you are responsible for your ontological intake and for the variety of the ontological shock that you can tolerate. But I think that we can tolerate more the more we do. And again, you're up against the clock, because the older you get, the less friends you make, and generally this is, and the less opportunities you have. So it's really about planting seeds as you go along, and taking a few risks, and not being, you're not just living the safe life, because it's like dying with a wardrobe of the best clothes that you never wore.
I think that's an image that many of us can relate to. Yeah. It's so interesting exploring the idea of an obsession almost with healing or healing related processes and how there might be a market just developing around that. And of course, there's a lot of potential with that for a lot of people. And I often like to think of it instead as calibration. If we want to come back to it, it's not necessarily healing. Yeah, it might have a healing tone to it. But if we think about our systems and the lenses they cultivate in terms of meaning making and qualitative or phenomenal experience, we can think of what might be a ritual to return to if we get too offset in a certain direction and lose a bit of psychological flexibility, or forget something of true value to integrate into our awareness and our relationships. Then it might be that many rituals or initiations can help recalibrate us in this sense. And perhaps that is what is really of what we need, many of us at the moment. Matt Segal refers to metaphysical massage, which is fairly analogous to what I'm referring to here, because I think that has many layers to it when it comes to what it means to feel feel the transformational process in a context of healing. But it's also about calibrating our integration process, and as you said, that reminder that it's not just about, possibility can always go beyond any capacity to accommodate it. And this is one of the naive things when you're lost in a a zeitgeist that you don't come to realize. You're someone that's no doubt come to realize this through your access to and participation in extraordinary experiences, myself included, that possibility is always beyond any construct. Um, Alan Watts used to say that human beings suffer from the delusion. What was it? That the entire universe is held together by the categories of human thought, right? Um, so again, the constructs that we apply too much uh, life energy emphasis to, that are not necessarily enabling us of a real beingness which is enriched. Another thing I'm really curious about that, in terms of your perspective, is often when we think of perennialism, esoteric lenses and forms of understanding, mythology, whether it's Greek or from some other part of the world, ancient India, all kinds of areas, often there's the idea that there are many different layers to what it means to be human. And this is a very salient thing for me to really bring into consciousness as I often work with it from a perspective of concepts like hylomorphism, where there's a geometry of a different nature, or a metaphysical nature prior to the physiological aspect of what it means to be human. And in some systems, there are many layers, or koshas, they might refer to them. And what I'm curious about when you encounter entities, for instance, in a DMT trance, In what ways are these entities potentially, we can refer to things like Rupert Sheldrake's ideas of morphic fields, or, some layer that could be part of our humanness. And as you emphasize that, it's almost reminding us that, hey, it's not about this necessarily, it's about how to be in a human context within yourself. How do these different layers, do you think, convey meaning in the context of both hyperhumanism and what it might be to be in relationship to various entities in transcendent states?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. It's this over anthropomorphizing that a lot of us are guilty of, and again, it's that whole solipsism, thinking that you're the center of the universe, and I think that that's again the transhuman agenda, right? That you are the center of the universe, and that you have every right to be. So it's really, there's semantics that are kind of problematic here, because in some sense, that's really hyperhumanism, in the sense that if you put hyper before humanism and humanism is the apex creature, then that's really what the transhumans want. They wanna basically be the foreground of all of it, and I think that there's so much pseudoscience around it, because they talk about uploading consciousness as if we're privy to what consciousness is. That we don't know what it is, and hopefully we'll never find out. I love the idea of keeping the mystery alive. So I think that, yeah, it's about Umwelt hacking. It's about going into as much as we can with our limited dynamic range. And I think that's why dissolving your human boundaries and understanding what it's like to be a forest, or to be a octopus, or or any kind of other species, where you have this Umwelt, and Umwelt is your sensorial system, and it's very different experience for a lobster, as it is for a human. So we're what's so rich about this planet and this experience is that you have all these different species experiencing the same planet extraordinarily differently, which creates this amazing context engineering. So context engineering again is this idea that we can adopt new visual systems or new auditory systems, and therefore all the content that already exists changes according to the senses that you're applying to that content. So I'm very much still on the fence as to what I'm experiencing when it's these entities in this DMT realm, for instance, whether it is just a higher self, or an archetype, or even myself in the future that I'm experiencing. But there are lots of clues as to these things having their own independent existence, and that's super exciting. But it's exciting either way, whether these things are present when I'm not looking, or whether I'm actually just incredibly imaginative. I think it's a win-win situation. So yeah, I'm very much still open to the investigation, and I hope the mystery never dies, and I hope we never find out if these things. All I know is that they're really angry if you keep going back, which is fascinating, isn't it? It's like that there is that continual monitoring, and one of the most amazingly potent experiences I had was my first ever DMT trip inside an fMRI scanner, and the amount of benevolence I experienced from these entities. And they're giving up the cosmic joke, so as I'm going in there, and these scanners are so loud, and obviously you're taking this incredibly sensitizing medicine, and suddenly I'm being shown, bang, like, you're immortal, but you're having a human experience right now. What's going on? Why are you in the scanner? Are you dying? You're not scheduled. So giving up the cosmic joke to calm me down, sort of saying, this is what your base nature is this non-dual reality. Here you are, just to calm me down. This is what you are, but you're having a human experience right now. Are you dying? Do you need help? And I had to calm down the entities. So it's very much this role reversal where normally you're given over to one, as McKenna says, it's like don't be giving over to the intensity of the wonder, like try and sit in it. And in fact, I was having to do the same for them. I was like, guys, I know you're the ones normally scanning me, but currently I'm being scanned over here. It's a research study. So that was a big insight, that there certainly is this kind of benevolence. And also it taught me that not to abuse this stuff, because if it's true that you're going in, and I know plenty of people that go in regularly with their vape pens or whatever on the dance floor, it probably becoming a bit of a nuisance, and you're crying wolf a lot of the time. And maybe when you do need this benevolence, these guides, they may not be so quick to turn up if you're constantly popping up. So my main concern about things like DMTx, and the reason why I'm involved in this going forwards, is it can become a transhuman approach to the substance, where you're literally just plugging in at will, potentially then colonizing the realm. Because at the moment, and it's probably something that the entities are very happy about, is that we don't have a way of getting there permanently, but this technology opens that up. So how do we avoid the usual extraction? Because it is an extraction. It's not ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is about 20% DMT. This is 100% infused directly into you. So how do we make sure that we are not circumventing the human experience? It's the hikikomori. If you haven't heard the term, hikikomori is the 500,000 plus young, mostly men in Japan, that have logged out of society, saying it's too tough. I'm not going to take part anymore. I'm just going to game. I'm going to live in a short, brutal life, because they don't tend to live very long, because they don't go outside. They're hermits, and so they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, because without community, without exercise, we don't survive. So there are these fundamental necessities as humans that seem requirements for our thriving, let alone surviving. So yeah, I guess I'm very much aware that these things that I'm involved with, whether it's cyberdelics, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's AI, all of these things can be taken a hyperhuman approach or a transhuman approach. And I know that's kind of very binary as well, and kind of limiting when you've only got the black or the white, and it's the white mirror or the black mirror. I think there is a third way. I think there is a transjective approach, where you move beyond the subject object, and you start to think about how are these things relating to each other? How does hyperhumanism relate to transhumanism? And how can they help each other in a sense?
Yes, it's a very open approach to the ongoing discourse here, I think. Isn't it very interesting, the idea that there are these hyper contexts where some kind of interbeing like signaling is taking place, or some kind of intuitive process of communication, however we contextualize how that's possible, quantum entanglement, morphic resonance, all kinds of possibilities here for sort of working with information ideas. But the idea that there could be a particular capacity or way in which that is possible to convey meaning, and that it could be a, a sense that when it's opened up into in a more casual or dissonant manner based on contextual dissonance, that it could be being contaminated, or the potential of it could be being disrupted, and maybe there's something at stake there. Maybe that's part of what you're sort of getting at there, when they don't seem to like magnetic fields or whatever. But when you were just detailing that, I was just thinking of just how unbelievable it would be to be in that circumstance, embodied, and yet experiencing so many layers of dissonance simultaneously, and hyper dissonance of the nth degree. And I can just consider how few people would be able to cope with that without having some kind of an adverse reaction. You seem to be able to bring order to the chaos quite well, as you sort of assimilate afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's a discipline. I mean, I talked with Chris Timmerman about this, that when we started the DMTx journey, it was 3 months of visits to Imperial spread across 3-week gaps, and it's like DMT church. So it is like a 3-month meditation. And if I did a lot of work on the dieter, and I had a lot of mechanisms in place, because I think that there is an exchange. I think that if you can understand that you're giving up something by going in there, and they're gaining, whoever they is, and maybe it is just a dialectic with yourself, who knows, but there does seem to be this this that you are giving up, or at least allowing them to explore you in terms of your ontological makeup. So the thinking, feeling, doing, being, that's very different to what they normally have access to. So I think that ontologically, what they're operating within is a very different realm of ontology. It's a very different realm of existence that we can't necessarily comprehend, but you're exchanging. So it's a playpen. I think that often people experience this mesh-like structure that's formed for them to observe you, and I think that that's the thing, that you suddenly become the moth that's attracted to the light, and there's this exchange going on. So I think both parties benefit. But if we are to then create a technology like DMTx that enables this communication to be continuous, then maybe that benevolence will diminish, or maybe will increase. Who knows? I think that that's what we're here to find out. But my take on DMTx is that this is an opportunity to bring more back from that realm, to do deeper investigations, to try and understand, a bit like what they're doing with lucid dream research. Now there's ways of inducing lucid dreams more more reliably, and of course there's a transhuman approach to lucid dreaming, which is to put on a headband and then it just fires in a small amount of electricity into your brain whilst you're asleep, and that will induce supposedly a lucid dream. And there's a whole history there, and there's this new headband coming out called Prophetic from Luma, or rather the company's called Prophetic and the headband's called Luma, Luma. But there's also a hyperhuman approach, which is to do the work, the reality testing, where you're looking at your hand every hour of the day, of the waking day, and you're like, am I dreaming? Am I dreaming? Am I dreaming? And then eventually you'll do that in a dream, and then you'll notice one finger's a bit longer than it should be, and then you're like, oh my god, I'm actually asleep. And then that's your way in. So there's waking back to sleep. There's lots of practical ways of doing it. It takes work, it takes effort. And my worry is that if we have a device that takes away that need for the work, that we will create this kind of dependency on the technology. And I don't know if you've seen that. I think it was an Australian film, actually, Strange Days, where they crack dream recording. And so the new films won't necessarily be made by AI, even. They'll be made by your own brain and recorded by AI and visual computer vision, recording your visual cortex, etc. And then we'll have another hikikomori, which is escape from the human experience, because all people will do is they'll go to sleep, they'll optimize for sleep, for dreaming, and then they'll make the most wildest content, and then that will be the new economy. The new thing will be who's having the wildest dreams, and then that's your content creation. So yeah, I think that these things are moving at a pace. We are experiencing these disruptive technologies, and I think as Gerard Lanier says, it's not so much about the technology that will drive us insane, it's the perception of the technology. And so many people are believing that AI is sentient, that there's some sort of sentience there. Of course there's no sentience. It's mimicry. It looks incredible, and it feels incredible, and it's eerie because it's gathering all of human culture and then able to draw upon that to give you this kind of impression of sentience.
Yes, thank you. There's a few things I'd like to tie together at this point, which build upon a lot of what you've expressed and shared there. You might be familiar with this reference, but I recall Grant Morrison about, 20 years ago, talking about his experiences with hashish, meeting what he assimilated with Terence McKenna's idea of the elves. And he basically described this as what was communicated in the context of ontology recapitulates phylogeny, was the idea that in some sense, and again, this is downloaded into the zeitgeist in various ways, that they cannot change whatever they are. They cannot change. So in order to experience these qualities that we're associating with hyperhumanism that could be unique in contrast to their existence, and not to get too beyond the transjective here, that still maintains some sense of interconnection here. But the idea was that they need to almost insert themselves into a process to experience what it means to undergo the conditions of transformation, of growing as an organism and developing the phenomenological constraints associated with that. And so that always stuck in my mind when it comes to what is so important to not lose when it comes to the metaphysics of being human, and what I've been confronted by as well when it comes to, attempts to, I guess, discover if there's anything in transcendence which makes coping with life a bit easier. There's always been this ultimate mirroring of existential meaning, coming back to what it means to be human, to be able to inhabit a body, the ecosystem of the body, and its various challenges, its perceptual contexts, the capacity to move in various ways, the way evolution has cultivated the conditions for eco locomotion type sensibilities, the way we can have pets and obviously connect with one another through different communication modalities. There's something just utterly unique about being human, and it could be that this is what that, if we were to stay within a transjective context of we're all connected at some level of ontology, but also there's a contrast dynamic in which we're kind of looking out at this other transcendent ideal that we're projecting and transiently experiencing, and they might be in some sense looking into a constraint and understanding, or at least attempting to convey the absolute potential associated with the non-dual or the ontological circumstance beyond language, and yet also simultaneously convey that it's an absolute magical phenomenon to be metaphysically in a growing human body. As you said, that is actually going to undergo a degradation point at some point, and it's going to lead to some phase in which we dissolve back into this broader context of the ecosystem. And so I'm very curious about how organisms in relationship can communicate across different dimensions of wholeness and convey meaning which could enable the overall connection to whole making. To the degree to which we do the integrative work, and we do understand how precious it is and transient it is to inhabit these bodies. And so, although I do have a lot of appreciation for how we can expand ourselves in various ways through technology, maybe even prolong our capacity to relate in these bodies, I also understand that ultimately there's perhaps an implicate power associated with being back in a place of potentiality that being human must realize through its own demise.
Yeah, no, I really am a big fan of Gebser and his stages of life or periods of consciousness, and the idea that each one builds on the next. So his 5 are the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the mental, and the integral, or the aperspectival, which is where we are now. And, as I say, each stage integrates all of the benefits and all of the learnings from the one before. And it really balances the pathos and the logos, but balances them ethically. And I think that, at the moment we're seeing the rise of AI, which is very much about logos, is very much about the intelligence and the cognition and the outsource, which leaves room, much greater room, really, for now pathos and the return to feeling, the return to the body at a time which is actually hugely important and critical, that we have this return to the body when we've got to the point where we were in danger of outsourcing even that to the machines. And I think you can see it, that people want to be out with community, and they want the lights to go off to a certain extent, where they can be forced into community and back to a level of interactivity that isn't technologically mediated. So I think that we're like I say, we talked about the Gnostic and the Hermetic principle. So the Gnostic, the material prison that we're within, and now back to embracing reality as a divine cosmic dream, as the Hermeticists say. So I think that we're unifying again the society with the spiritual. And also I like to think about Bernardo Kastrup's work with the dissociative alters, the thing that keeps us, the thing that enabled us to become these discrete, this Maya, the illusion of discrete entities, is the dissociative alter that lies at the beginning or the heart of our break from unity into these individuals. So I was going to ask you actually about holomorphism, because you mentioned the term. Could you elaborate on what holomorphism is?
I guess there are many different approaches in terms of the words I could use, but I would relate to it at this moment as the capacity to experience a transformational state in which whole and part are, in some sense, enacting a concrescence of some kind. So there's an aspect of morphological process in play here, but it's ultimately being given meaning by the whole making aspect of it, I would say. One thing that I wanted to also bring into what you just expressed earlier was recently I've been revisiting Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher, and some interesting ideas that are quite fundamental to many canons in metaphysics and embodied metaphysics come to mind. In any case, he envisioned the divine as this interplay between strife and love. And so, often we look at, Taoism, we look at yin yang and this kind of becoming aspect in between as mediating consciousness between the non-dual and the dual. And what I'm really curious about is how these different ways we reimagine ourselves, or else these tendencies otherwise in the context of the technology of our times, enable or disable this balance of the enriching aspects, the inside out aspects, we might say, of love amongst the ever present strife or capacity for strife to disable. And I think the challenge amongst all of this really is perhaps we're creating human nature. Perhaps it's not this fixed notion or concept or paradigm that we're ready to capitulate into constraint, that we're actually, as we do participate in context, we're actually creating it. And as long as we're integrating an awareness of the potential to do so, inherent in self-organization and our innate capacities, there's perhaps the hope there that the conditions of life as we experience it will be kept open without the risk of civilizational collapse actually otherwise taking hold at this point.
Yeah, beautiful. I think, it does seem like we're, again, going back to Chris Spacia's work. He talks about this 500-year window of not such great stuff happening. But it's almost like, if we consider how much we've damaged, as humans, how much damage we've caused, it does seem like we need to go through some initiation, a correction, and and I think that it's, it is a depressing thought that we may not be, going into a transcendence, but more of an incendence. I think trust the process, and eventually there will be this rebirth, and it may take us long to undo the damage that we've done, as it has been to make that damage occur. So, but yeah, it's been a massively interesting conversation, and super grateful for your points of view on this.
When I hear about your schedule, I'm hearing a bit of hyperhumanism, just keeping up with the pace of some of that, and across different time zones, no doubt. And I'm hearing that you're wanting to really give it your all in the context of we've got limited time to do whatever we determine as meaningful with our time and energy, really.
Yeah, I think it's well, as I say to a lot of people, it's really the hyperhuman process is a multi-generational one, and as I always say, think about what you're doing now. How will it benefit the next 5 generations or the next 50 generations to come? And let that be your guiding principle, rather than just how is it benefiting you, how is it benefiting your family, your children, or whatever. How is it going to benefit their children and the children after? And I think that if you can honestly, hand on heart, say that this is my legacy, this is it's a no-brainer that's going to lead to a better world. And of course, it's a challenge because it's not black and white. What we do doesn't necessarily, it's the cause and effect thing. Again, it's like we're not sure of the implications of what we're doing. Like the fact that I spent the first sort of half of my career training astronauts and surgeons using mixed reality, that same technology can be taken out of a tech for good perspective and used in the military complex, which is where it all came from. The military's sort of producing these technologies for us. So yeah, I think have a stress test everything you're doing, and don't be complacent.
Make beautiful contexts, eh? That seems to be what it's about. You have potential, and there's the quality of the shaping. Speaks to a little bit of that whole making Cam was speaking to. All these marvelous creations, these marvelous buildings, whether in the internal sense of the worldviews and ways we can understand and experience music, to as well the architecture and geometry we can participate in. And so that transjective, or that relation between then inner and outer, or the subjective and the objective, and contextology given that relationality and our participation with it, that seems to me a deeply empowering invitation to be part of creating those, exploring what it means to actually engage then in creation, what it is to be creativity. That's where so much of this comes back to for me, and finds its way in inspiration in so many ideas I heard shared there in hyperhumanism and otherwise. So I want to thank you both for that beautiful conversation. Seems like a nice place to land it, unless anybody has anything final they'd like to add. Well, beautiful, guys. Thank you, hey? Thank you for taking the time.